What do you know about Greek mythology?
My mom's Athena. She's smart and she's wise. She swore off gluten and she swore off lies.
No, not those ones. Well, sorta. The stories of the 12 major gods and the ancient heroes who served under them have been something I've enjoyed my entire life. I read the Percy Jackson books back in 3rd grade and only continued to expand my knowledge of Greek myth from there. On top of that, I also love musical theater, having discussed shows like The Lightning Thief, Wicked, Evil Dead the Musical, and Back to the Future the Musical on this channel before. So, it should be no surprise that after seeing Hadestown last week, I have a million things I want to say about it. Now, I know there are probably a good amount of people who have never heard of Hadestown before. Despite winning 8 Tony Awards, including Best Musical, it hasn't exactly become a household name like Wicked or Hamilton. Circulating Broadway in 2016, Hadestown tells the story of 2 Greek myths, the tales of Hades and Persephone, and Orpheus and Eurydice. The story is narrated by the messenger of the gods himself, Hermes, and set in the Depression era. Traditionally, these 2 myths have nothing to do with each other, being set hundreds of thousands of years apart. But the way Hadestown manages to weave them together is astounding and magical. But before I get into how it does that, we should probably talk about the 2 myths I just mentioned. Both of these myths are love stories with deeper messages about doubt and commitment. Obviously, this is going to come with a sort of spoiler warning for the musical since it is an adaptation of both tales. I'll tell you what to skip if you want to avoid any kinds of spoilers for the show. The tale of Hades and Persephone starts with a bit of background about the Greek gods and goddesses. Most people know who Hades is, the Greek god of the dead, ruler of the underworld. Meanwhile, Persephone is the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. In search of a queen to rule the underworld with him, Hades set his sights on Persephone. One day when she was picking flowers, Hades took her to the underworld. There, they fell in love, and Hades tricked Persephone into eating food from the underworld, bonding her to that plane forever. Eventually, an agreement was made, and Persephone was allowed to return to Earth for a portion of the year. This granted the Earth the 4 seasons. Demeter would allow the harvest to grow while Persephone was on the surface, creating spring and summer. Meanwhile, the fall and winter months are caused by Demeter's grief during the time that Persephone is in the underworld. The other half of the story of Hadestown is the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus was a poet and songwriter, considered one of the best, thanks to his mother being a muse. His most famous adventure outside of his own myth was when he traveled with Jason and the Argonauts to retrieve the Golden Fleece, using his magical expertise to escape the sirens. Meanwhile, Eurydice was a nymph who had fallen in love with Orpheus and his musical skills. Eventually, the two would be wed. Unfortunately, their marriage did not last long, as Eurydice died shortly after an encounter with a poisonous snake. At this point, I am about to discuss the spoilery bits of the myth that will tie into the show, so if you don't want to know anything, skip to the time displayed on screen. After Eurydice's death, Orpheus traveled to the underworld in an attempt to bring her back. On his journey, he encountered many challenges, such as crossing the river Styx or Cerberus the 3-headed dog. Thankfully, his musical skills allowed him to impress his way unharmed down to Hades himself. Once there, he played a song so impressive that Hades issued Orpheus a challenge to win back Eurydice. Orpheus and Eurydice would traverse the underworld in a straight line, Orpheus in front with Eurydice behind. If Orpheus could make it back to the surface without looking back at Eurydice, having to trust in her love, then Eurydice would return to the land of the living. However, if Orpheus looked back, Eurydice would return to Hades forever. As I'm sure you can guess, doubt sets in, and right at the finish line, Orpheus looks back, permanently killing Eurydice. This tale is obviously a lesson in trust, doubt, and commitment. So now that we're all familiar with the myths that make up the show, let's explore how they all come together. If you haven't seen the show, now might be a good time to leave if you want to know nothing. Obviously, this is going to be full of spoilers for the story of the show. Discretion is advised. That being said, the entire show is sung through, meaning you could listen to the soundtrack as a sort of audio drama, if you're not worried about spoilers. Personally, I would say the visuals complete the effect, but it's your call. When we begin our story, we learn that Hades and Persephone have fallen out of love. This is hundreds if not thousands of years after their initial marriage. If you remember, their relationship and Persephone's journey to the surface are what provide the Earth with the seasons. Currently, Persephone is held underground longer than usual, and spends her time on the surface drunk, unable to properly provide the spring or summer. This has plunged Earth into an eternal winter, with the occasional blazing hot summer. Meanwhile on Earth, Orpheus is a poor boy serving as a ward under Hermes. He has impressive musical abilities, like in the original myth, and is attempting to use them for good. He hopes to write a song that will bring back the spring/summer, seeing as it does have the power to summon a single red flower. We've learned from Hermes that the song Orpheus is working on is the original love song Hades sang to Persephone when he took her. This song, plus the inciting incident of the eternal winter, already connects the two myths immediately at the start of the show. While Orpheus' song doesn't quite bring back spring or summer, it does attract the attention of a young girl, Eurydice. In this version of the story, Eurydice is given much more agency and backstory. Instead of being a simple nymph that falls in love with Orpheus, she's instead a starving girl, lost in the eternal winter created by Persephone and Hades falling out, once again connecting these two myths. Hermes mentions that she's never committed to anything, running away from any home she's ever had. However, Orpheus catches her eye when she sees him as the one good thing in this frozen, rotten world. Meanwhile, in the underworld, Hades builds Hadestown for Persephone. Rather than talking to her and trying to solve the problems with their relationship, he instead tries to appease her with physical gifts. He has created sunlight in the underworld with artificial lighting, heats the town by burning natural resources in his newly built factory, and keeps Hadestown separated from the poor with a wall. Unfortunately, that last part is a bit too timely. On another note, I love the implied detail that Hades fuels and funds his factory with the natural resources and treasures from the ground. As the god of the underworld, all things that originate in the ground like oil, gemstones, and gold are considered part of his domain in some ancient myths. Again, a fun little detail that makes the Greek mythology nerd in me smile. At this point, the fallout between Hades and Persephone causes a monstrous winter storm to begin. However, Orpheus is too wrapped up in trying to finish the song, ignoring the danger of the storm. Orpheus mirrors Hades in this moment, too focused on how his song will fix the world physically, while ignoring Eurydice's call for help during this storm. During his research, Orpheus does finally come to the conclusion that healing Hades and Persephone's relationship will fix the seasons. Unfortunately, Eurydice does not have the same optimism or commitment to fixing the world as her husband. Instead, she lets doubt set in and runs away, falling into the arms of Hades. Once again tying these two myths together, Hades, in an attempt to make Persephone jealous, offers Eurydice a deal. She dies to escape the freezing underworld and comes to serve him in Hadestown, where she'll never be cold or hungry again. There's a bit of a sexual undertone to the initial offer, though it thankfully doesn't go that way. This new version of Eurydice's death also grants her character much more agency and ties the two myths together once again. Rather than dying from a random snake bite, Eurydice instead makes the choice to go with Hades, dying in the process. All of this leads up to the best moments of the entire show that I thought deserved its own section in this video. Wait for me depicts the moments that Orpheus realizes Eurydice is gone and decides to go get her, snapping out of his trance-like state of songwriting. In order for Orpheus to reach Eurydice, Hermes lets him know of a back door into the underworld, something that shows up all the time in Greek myth. And this sequence is the most impressive in the show in my opinion. During Orpheus's journey through the underworld, the actor is on the run from Hades' minions, literally booking it on the turntable like it's a treadmill. The crew also cranks the smoke machines up to an 11, allowing Orpheus to duck and hide in the massive amounts of smoke on screen. And you might be asking, what is he hiding from? Well, as I mentioned, servants of Hades are guarding the underworld, obviously not wanting the living to enter their domain. And this is an incredible piece of stage work as the actor playing Orpheus has to duck and dodge swinging searchlights that are trying to locate Orpheus. I also felt personally victimized in part of the show, as at one point the spotlights shine into the crowd, and I was personally blinded from where I was sitting. And just when Orpheus is caught, what does he do but he starts to sing the song he's been working on this whole time. And just like in the myth, all of Hades' minions let him go, which I thought was a nice touch. In the myth, he sings Cerberus to sleep, and Charon lets him ride the boat across the river Styx, impressed by his singing skills. So it would make sense here that we have this very powerful song about the god's love, and he uses it as his ticket into the underworld. Additionally, almost all of Act 1 has been taking place in the overworld, and the stage now has to shift into Hadestown. Depending on your production, this happens in many different ways. For example, in the initial Broadway run, the walls split open, revealing Hadestown behind the tavern that most of Act 1 takes place in. I've seen other productions where certain doors open on stage to reveal parts of Hadestown, or the background rises and falls. I love the reaction that this gets from the audience every time. During my own show, you could hear all the chatter as the background shifted into the wall of Hadestown. I really hope with the pro shoot that they're filming this year that they include the audience's reaction to the shifting background. So now we begin Act 2, and this is where I strongly encourage, if you have not seen the show, to leave this video now. You've heard some general spoilers in Act 1, but this is the end of the musical. This is where you're going to want to go into it as unknowledgeable as possible. So when we begin Act 1, we realize that Eurydice is in the underworld, and she has sold her soul to servitude. Again, like I said, at the end of Act 1, it's implied that her and Hades' relationship might be sexual, as he's trying to tie these myths together and make Persephone jealous. But he actually is just tricking her into working for him in the factory that powers Hadestown. And during her time in the underworld, Eurydice begins to forget her name and personality, which, again, is something in Greek myth, where in certain myths, you will forget who you are the longer you spend in the underworld. Thankfully, Orpheus is able to snap her out of it, but not before confronting Hades himself. Now, you might remember that I said in the original myth that Orpheus played a song for Hades and Hades let him go. However, Hades isn't as willing in this first confrontation, and instead sends his minions after Orpheus in a good old-fashioned dance fight. And I did immediately get West Side Story, as they are having a fight on stage, but it is dance moves and choreographed moments. However, before he's defeated, Orpheus begins to sing the song again. The song of Hades and Persephone. And this song, because like we said, it has the power to bring something out of people. In the myth, it's just said that it's Orpheus himself that has this magical singing power. However, I like the idea that it's tied to this song about Hades and Persephone. And so with this song, he inspires the workers to rise up, which once again forces Hades to confront Orpheus. An interesting thing to note during this moment as well is that Persephone tries to reason with Hades, pointing out that Orpheus is just a boy in love, like they were long ago. However, Hades is too cold and closed off at this point in the story to realize that. So he once again confronts Orpheus, and he sings about how he believes he has to trap Persephone to love him, and he tries to get Orpheus to believe this too, telling him,
"If you wanna hold a woman's son, hang a chain around her throat, made a many-carat gold, shackle her from wrist to wrist with sterling silver bracelets, fill her pockets full of stones, precious ones, diamonds, bind her with a golden band, take it from an old man.
Again, like I mentioned before, all of those things fall under Hades' domain as god of the underworld. So we're once again seeing that he just believes if he bounds Persephone and everything that already belongs to him, she eventually will too. And this is where the two myths meet their climax as Hades offers Orpheus to sing for him. In the original myth, Orpheus had to sing to win Eurydice back. But here he must now sing for his own life, as well as Eurydice's. Epic 3 is the finalized version of the song Orpheus has been singing the entire show, and it turns out Eurydice was the missing ingredient. He needed his own love before he could finish writing a love song. And so during this moment, while he is singing to Hades, he's also singing to Eurydice, and includes his own reflection on love. And like we said, this is the love song of Persephone and Hades, where it recounts that love doesn't make sense. And Orpheus notes that just like the myth says, fixing their love will fix the world. Orpheus has found the way to solve both of these myths in one song. He will bring Persephone and Hades together, while also winning back Eurydice. And eventually everyone on stage joins in on this song, as again it has that magical power to inspire all of the underworld, and Hades and Persephone fall back in love. And Hades actually sings. I'd be lying if I said this wasn't the tearjerker of the show. It's beautiful to watch these two fall back in love as they hear the song of their love from ancient times. And what do but dance? And so you might think, there we go, we solved it, yay! But if you remember the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, there's one last thing, and that's the trial. So at this point, Eurydice embraces Orpheus, saying, "Take me home," showing her growth and that she's fully committed to Orpheus. Because if you remember at the beginning of the story, Hermes said she runs away from everything, but instead she chooses to run towards Orpheus. However, Hades can't just let them go, being reminded by the three fates of Greek mythology that letting people leave the land of the dead will make him appear weak. However, he does have that new warmth in his heart, granted to him by the love of Persephone that was fixed by Orpheus. And so in a way to tie these two myths together in one final attempt, Hades makes Orpheus a deal. Orpheus must be put through the same test that Hades endures every summer and spring. While Persephone is on the surface, Hades always doubts and questions if she will return. Now, Orpheus must do the same. Orpheus and Eurydice will walk in a single file line, Orpheus in front with Eurydice behind, and if he looks back at her, she will remain in Hadestown forever. And this leads into the Wait For Me reprise, which is now, instead of Orpheus calling out to Eurydice, it is now Persephone and Eurydice who are now calling out to their men to wait for them. This is about putting your love on pause and trusting in your partner that they will come back to you. Hades lets Persephone go for the spring/summer, confident that she'll return to the underworld this time, the myth now being fully restored. Meanwhile, Orpheus is filled with more doubt than ever, having Eurydice sing to him to wait for him as she will follow him to the surface from the underworld. However, just as the myth of Hades and Persephone has been restored, the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice must also end the same way every time. This is where we get arguably the final moment of the show. Doubt sets in. And I have to admit, I was so anxious during the show while watching this sequence, even though I know how the myth ends, being a Greek mythology nerd. The lighting is insane in this sequence, as the whole stage is dark, only lit by the spotlight on Orpheus and the lanterns of the Fates. And during this whole sequence, Eurydice is behind Orpheus. However, she is cloaked in shadow that makes even you, the audience, question if she's there. And just as the myth goes, right as Orpheus is about to make it, he turns around and looks at her for one last moment, killing her, sending her back to Hadestown. And when I tell you the audible gasp followed by silence in every showing of this production is insane. And that is essentially the end of our tale, as Hermes comes out to say that we're going to sing it again. And the story starts over, hopeful for a happy ending at some point. And I think this ending is very interesting because it is pretty open-ended, and I have heard so many different interpretations of this ending. I have heard people say that the stage show itself is the Greek gods telling the story over and over, hoping to change it. Meanwhile, the lady sitting behind me at my showing remarked that it's Orpheus's personal hell to replay his failures over and over again. While it might not be the happiest ending, it is a hopeful ending, seeing as now that Hades and Persephone's love have been restored, they can hope for one day Orpheus and Eurydice to get their happy ending as well, tying these myths together forever. So now that we've talked about the story, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about my personal experience / the presentation of the show. You see, much of Hadestown is focused around the set, seeing as the Broadway and West End productions take place on a turntable stage. If you're not familiar with this is where the stage literally has, as the name implies, a turntable in the ground and can spin and rotate. Many of the sequences involve the characters running on the turntable, or on Broadway and West End, the rising or falling floor. Moments like Wait For Me or Chant have the characters drop down, literally lowering down into Hades, into the underworld. So with that being said, my version was the non-equity tour. If you're not familiar, I'm not going to go crazy into it because even I find it hard to understand at times. Basically, all you need to know is that a non-equity tour is not with the union, which means they are able to perform on a smaller stage and at more locations with some sacrifices. So for example, in the full production of Hadestown, when they're in the tavern, there are tables and chairs and patrons sitting around. At my production, it was a smaller stage, there were no tables, just chairs. On top of that, my theater lacked a turntable, and so there was no rising or falling floor. And with this lack of rising or falling floor, you might question, well, how do some songs like Chant or Wait For Me end? Because those songs end with Hades, Persephone, and Orpheus plunging down into the underworld. Instead, the characters walk off stage or the lights go out sooner. Which I know sounds anticlimactic, but it's not like they just walk off stage. They are walking up the stairs towards Hades' domain, and then they exit stage while still singing. On top of this, in the original show, when Eurydice dies, she drops through that sinking floor. In my showing, the actress for Eurydice did a cool, what I would describe as a possum death, where she freezes like a statue, and the actors playing Hades' minions pick her up, and again, she doesn't move, she's frozen in place, and they carry her off screen. With the lack of a turntable, most of the movement on stage is also done manually by the actors. For example, in Chant Reprise, Hades circles Orpheus on the turntable in the original show. Instead, the actor playing Hades just marches in a circle around Orpheus. Same thing with the workers. In the original production, the workers circle Hades and Persephone while Chant plays. Instead, they do a little crouched march around Hades and Persephone, which I thought worked well. I will admit though, after seeing slime tutorials and pro shots after my showing, I am a little sad about the lack of the turntable, especially after seeing interviews where the director herself said that the turntable is an essential part of the show. However, the absence of the turntable isn't really felt in the show. And that's because the actors on stage are so great for this national tour. All of the main cast is killing it. They all move fluidly across the stage and they act their asses off and give quite a show. There was literally a woman in the row in front of me during intermission that stood up, turned back to the rest of us and said, "Guys, this cast is amazing, right?" I mean, like I said, a total stranger, but it was like, yes, you're right, this is amazing. Like, if you asked me, would I rather have not seen it at all? Obviously not. I don't feel like I missed out on anything. Seeing it like this is better than not seeing it at all. Additionally, I just wanted to bring back those Hadestown spotlights, because I managed to get a pretty good seat for the show, deciding to treat myself. And it was the perfect spot to be blinded. Every time the spotlights went into the crowd in songs such as Wait For Me or Chant Reprise, I was blinded. And again, that might sound bad, but I was having a great time. If anything, I felt more immersed. I too was blinded as Orpheus was when the spotlights catch him. And that's what makes this show so great, is that it is a beautiful production that tells two beautiful Greek myths and manages to tie them together. I personally can't wait for the pro shot that they're shooting this February. Pro shots of musicals can be tricky because they don't want to cut into the earnings of the Broadway musical. As long as this show isn't available, people are going to keep paying to go see it on Broadway. So hopefully this follows the path of Hamilton, where it comes out in the next year or so, rather than the path of something like Aladdin that has been filmed and has no release date. I strongly recommend you go see this show for yourself. The presentation of it is beautiful, and as a Greek mythology nerd, it was a great time watching these two myths be tied together. It really is a beautiful show. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you thought of the show, or if you've even seen it, in the comments down below. My friend Morgan M. Steele and I recently saw Come From Away, so expect a video on that as well. If you want to be here for that video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you know when that next one's coming. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.